Before time, there was nothing. And then... As the universe expanded from an infinitesimal point, great beings from other dimensions seeped into our reality, fleeing an incomprehensible conflict known as the Great Celestial War. As gravity compressed hydrogen into higher elements around them, the great gods slept, curling up to heal. Around one, a small blue planet formed, and as a young species on its surface grew, the great Earth Dragon, as the godlike being would become known, started to stir. In the early 20th century, some men and women started to develop great powers beyond any other. With the advent of these superheroes, the world, once very much like our own, would never be the same again. These are the stories of the Mirage universe, and you're listening to the Mirage Barrage.
Ethan! Miranda Swanson shouted while banging on her son's door. Ethan sighed while adjusting the perspective on the complicated 3D model he had displayed on one of his 3 curved monitors. He was seated on an elaborate computer chair with about a dozen different knobs to adjust it for his absolute comfort. His skinny frame was sunk into it in his usual half-lying slouch, keyboard at his hands. "What?" he finally shouted back towards his mother. His eyes were still on the monitors, the only source of light in his cluttered room. He had memorized the 4 or 5 steps necessary to navigate from his bed to his chair, which was a must as there was barely any room left on the floor. It wasn't all piled with junk or dirty laundry either. The vast majority of it was electrical equipment of various stripes, and not just the average teenage treasures of game stations and video players. Most of the equipment stashed about would be unrecognizable to all but a few of the most brilliant minds on the planet. And yet, these same machined marvels were shoved around haphazardly, most just gathering dust. "I'm coming in. We need to talk about the electricity bill," Mrs. Swanson said. "We've already talked about this," Ethan replied, barely paying attention as he typed several lines into the computer. The door clicked open, and a fresh ray of light burned through the room. Ethan narrowed his eyes in discomfort, but didn't look up. Although his mother was shorter than his lanky frame, Ethan slouched as he was, she towered over him. Ethan's unkempt blonde hair was the only thing visible from the door behind him. Mrs. Swanson folded her arms as she looked down at her son and the impressive rig he had set up. "The power bill was up even higher than last month's," she complained. "That's the 3rd month in a row." Ethan waved his hand. "All right, leave it here and I'll pay you back." "Ethan, that's not the point," Miranda went on. "You're almost 20 and you clearly have endless potential, but all you do is stay in your room all day." "All I need is in here," Ethan replied. "But what about your life? I got games, I got food, I got money, I've got contracts out the wazoo. But what about people? What about people? You know, friends, loved ones. Are you saying you don't love me? Ethan, you need to talk to other people. What have other people done for me lately?" "Well, you wouldn't know because you're stuck in here all day. And I'm in here all day because people suck." "Ethan, what? It's not like I'm unproductive. I've sold 9 different specifications for world-altering inventions. You weren't paid like it. It's not my fault that current technology can't fully utilize my genius or that engineers can't fully appreciate it. The future will remember me as an innovator, and they're the only people that I need. You know, the ones I don't have to talk to." "No one can live on their own forever, and if you really are as smart as you say you are, you don't believe me? I do believe you're brilliant, I'm saying." Brilliant? I'm a genius. My dark energy receptor will revolutionize astrophysics within 10 years. Ethan pointed to what appeared to be a donut-shaped satellite dish collecting dust in the corner. "Redcorp is still boring me with emails trying to understand the plans I sold them. It's really annoying, actually. Distracts from the more interesting things." "If your stuff is so revolutionary, then do something more with it. Follow through with it. Make a business of it. Don't just toss it aside." "I moved too fast for that," Ethan said dismissively. Waving towards an odd 3-legged silver component next to his computer tower, he explained, "I'm looking into Ansible networks now." "Is this all you want from life?" Mrs. Swanson finally asked, feeling defeated. "Just sitting in your room?" "Intellectual stimulation is all I need," Ethan replied flatly. "I could be perfectly happy being a brain in a jar so long as I had my computers." "If you keep staying in here much longer, that's all you will be," Mrs. Swanson huffed. "Cool. Another world first for Ethan Swanson, boy genius." "You're not a boy. You're a man now, or at least you should be. And if I have to force it on you, I will." Careful, you'll disturb our all-important interpersonal relationship, Ethan mockingly warned. What relationship? Mrs. Swanson shot back coldly. Since you're up here all day anyway, I think I can risk it. So here's the deal. Either you leave the house at least once a week for some sort of social activity, I don't care what, business, fun, whatever, or you move out. Wow, we're doing this. You really have to keep momming it up. Yes, because I am a mom and that's what we do. Oh, don't be such a primitive, Ethan seethed. I'm really disappointed we couldn't move past this and accept that we are two independent adults sharing the same dwelling for living accommodations. That's not how it works, Ethan. Well, it should be. Maybe in your virtual world, but out here in reality it doesn't, so either get out once a week or get out for good. Fine, Ethan said and flipped through several screens. You see what I did there? I just sorted apartment listings by price, happiness index, crime index, access to commodities, and overall isolation. I hacked into his satellite feeds to take a little look for myself and even pinged some of the cell towers to see how busy or disruptive the neighbors are. In 5 minutes, this place will be mine. Fine, but you still have to get out of the house to actually rent it out. Fine to you too, Ethan replied and hopped out of his chair. I'll do it now. Mrs. Swanson blinked in surprise. Fine, was all she said, and stepped out of her son's way as he marched down the stairs. He reached the bottom of the stairs. His father, Frank Swanson, was sunk into his favorite armchair, a book dwarfed in his hands, and glasses that never quite looked right on him perched on his nose. Hey, sport, he said cheerfully at Ethan, as if he hadn't just heard the argument upstairs. Actually, in fairness, he was often blissfully unaware of the interpersonal drama as it happened under his nose. Ethan grumbled a reply. His father didn't seem to mind, still smiling from his upholstered throne in front of a dusty trophy case from the 80s. What new invention have you made today? He asked. Magnetron, Ethan grumbled. No matter how he tried to explain that most of his work was research and experimentation, rarely the actual physical work of assembling a device, his father never seemed to actually quite get it. And if Ethan ever did explain what he was working on, his dad would just smile as his eyes became blank. He just wanted the highlights, the big plays. That's my boy, Mr. Swanson said, unaware he just complimented his son for inventing technology found in kitchens since the first microwave ovens appeared after World War II. Just as Ethan finished lacing up his shoes, he realized he hadn't grabbed his wallet, which, it occurred to him, that he might need. So he walked back upstairs, tiptoeing through his room, and returned to grab a jacket. Hey, butthead, guess who just beat your simulator high score? Ethan's sister, Suzanne, asked as he checked his pockets, a nagging at the back of his head suggesting he had forgotten something else. Suzanne, 3 years younger than him, was taking great delight in usurping this accomplishment. She leaned against the wall in the hallway, leading from the bedrooms to the entryway, a smirk across her face. I said that like a year ago, Ethan replied, hardly taking notice. Oh, is that all? Suzanne asked, miffed. Because you couldn't just stop telling everyone for months. You put your name as Ethan is greater than you, just to show off. That's a factual statement, Ethan muttered. I'll swing by on my way and update it. Realizing he forgot his phone, he dashed upstairs without listening to the protests of his sister. When he arrived back downstairs, she had settled on scoffing at his earlier promise. I know you're too arrogant to understand how reality works, but not even you can just casually set a new record on the green machine, she chided him. Then I'll just hack it, Ethan said, retying his shoe which had already come undone. That's not fair, Suzanne spluttered. Sure it is. Everyone must be informed that indeed Ethan is greater than you. It's a public service, really. Ethan walked out the door, Suzanne fuming. As he stepped out, she threw it open behind him and shouted back. At least everyone will know that Steph and my red and blue score is legit, and if you hack it, everyone will know because you don't have any friends to play it with you. Ethan didn't think too much about this at first, even as the door slammed behind him, but as he walked, his mind couldn't help but drift off into schemes of how to beat a two-player game single-handedly. Ethan skipped the simulator arcade on his way home. His head was too busy buzzing with unfamiliar thoughts about rent and legal agreements. His attempt to set a world record speed for renting an apartment had come up a little short. It turned out, making money by selling revolutionary technological ideas sounded a bit fishy to the landlord, so he had insisted on verifying a few facts first. It was all quite a pain, and Ethan hated the fact that he was no longer in control of the process but had to wait for someone else. He was so busy inwardly cursing at the landlord for not recognizing his obvious genius that he didn't notice that no lights greeted him from his house, despite the fact that the sun had just slid below the horizon. He didn't notice the unusual amount of litter blowing in the night breeze, or the slight smell of smoke either. He didn't even look up until he was at the feet of the driveway. Ethan stopped in his tracks. He gaped, not wanting to believe what he was seeing. His house had been destroyed. Half of the roof had been ripped off, gutting the house open like a dying creature. Books, chair legs, plates, and shattered window glass littered the yard, and small fires smoldered in the few remaining semi-intact rooms. Ethan dropped the recently signed papers, and they blew away in the cool wind. He ran blindly into the remnants. He pushed onto the front door, which jammed. He threw himself against it. Even his thin frame was enough to knock it down in this condition. Inside was no better. The walls that had just stood an hour before were nothing but rubble, and what were once treasured family possessions were now merely more broken shards littered across the floor. There was no place to walk without stepping on multicolored rubble. But Ethan didn't care. "Mom! Dad! Suzanne!" he shouted, but no one answered him. He crawled over the front door and the rubble behind it. He scrambled to his feet and immediately ran towards the bedrooms. He slipped and stumbled across the debris. His hand plunged into a pile of trash as he caught himself. Ethan pulled it, bleeding, free, and pulled himself back up. He scrambled, ignoring the pain, calling out again. Again, silence answered him. Ethan ran into what used to be the hallway to the bedrooms. Nothing here looked familiar. It looked like a hurricane had devastated everything here, blending everything into confetti. No wall stood higher than 1.5 feet, and nothing remained recognizable except... Ethan's room was like the eye of the storm. His bed, his devices, even his computer were all still standing, mostly untouched. And in the center of this mostly untouched scene was a strange, strange figure. He was either some sort of robot or some man in a strange metal armor. The dark gray metal gleamed menacingly, pieces near the elbows and knees extending into dangerous points. Despite clearly being advanced and sophisticated, the casting had an old-fashioned touch to it, bringing in mind intricate old Victorian architecture. The figure was framed by evil-looking wings extended up and to either side, emerging from twin rockets on its back. But of all of its features, its head was the most striking. It was a twisted, monstrous face disfigured by a great toothy grin and horns protruding from the front and back of the skull. Despite the manic expression permanently forged onto the figure's metal face, the body language looked somehow disappointed, and it was holding something. After Ethan got over the shock of his appearance, he realized that it was holding his own three-legged device, the Ansible node.
"This,"
the creature muttered to himself.
"This was all the signal was?"
He turned it in his hand, Ethan still staring. Finally, the creature turned, and that's when it saw him. Every fiery instinct that had compelled him to run into the house suddenly vanished. Instead, he was gripped with an icy fear.
"Are you the creature responsible for this?"
the gargoyle asked, holding out the Ansible node towards him. Ethan couldn't find his voice. The glowing eyes of the robot creature pierced through him, holding him in place.
"What is this?"
the gargoyle demanded. Ethan tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat.
"This is just a communication module, isn't it?"
the gargoyle asked again. Ethan nodded slightly. It was all he could do.
"All this way for nothing,"
the creature exclaimed, and he crushed it before dropping it to the floor. He seemed to consider his surroundings a moment before casting his gaze back to Ethan.
"You made all these things?"
he asked, now more conversationally. Ethan summoned up all of his remaining courage. "Where are they?" he asked shakily.
"They're somewhere around here,"
the gargoyle replied casually, waving a hand towards the rest of the house.
"These are quite impressive, actually,"
the gargoyle continued, as if Ethan weren't trembling before him.
"What are these?"
Ethan started breathing heavily. "What did you do to them?" he demanded.
"I did nothing to them," the gargoyle dismissed. "Nothing directly, anyway. This," he gestured towards the wreckage, "was merely collateral damage. Now tell me, what are these things?"
"What are you? What do you want?" Ethan shot back at him, eyes desperately scanning his own inventions for something that might do harm to the creature, but nothing he had could be quickly transformed into a weapon.
"Useless," the gargoyle decried. "The traumatized always babble too much, or don't speak at all. Never the Goldilocks zone."
And he turned away from Ethan, disgusted. He raised his arm and a cable shot out, piercing into Ethan's computer. It flickered to life, and screen after screen flashed past at lightning speed.
"You are a clever thing," the gargoyle said, amused. "It seems you—" "What's this?"
The gargoyle turned to the strange donut satellite dish. He picked it up from the junk on the floor and held it up.
This is something."
He turned back to the computer and more intently began to search through Ethan's data. Ethan couldn't focus on the specifics of that right now. He was furiously kicking his brain into gear. His gravity field detection rig was only a few feet away. It was turned off right now, but it had a massive power supply. If he could just get to it. The gargoyle leaned in towards the monitor, deeply interested.
Yes, I think I'll take it. Maybe this wasn't a waste after all," he was muttering.
Ethan stepped forward, carefully placing his feet in the familiar path that usually led from his door to his computer chair. Now it would bring him closer to the detection rig. He reached out, but couldn't make it without risking his balance. He glanced towards the gargoyle, but he was still absorbed in the computer's data. Ethan carefully stepped into the unfamiliar territory of his old junk. He set his foot in a small clearing and leaned over. His fingers just clasped around the detection rig, and he heaved it off the ground. Ethan glanced back towards the gargoyle. He had detached the wire and retracted it back into his arm, but he didn't turn back. He instead raised his arm and began to punch a few buttons on the console built into it. Ethan knew he didn't have much time. He immediately clawed open the panel on the rig and eagerly found the power supply. Just as the gargoyle lowered his arm, Ethan was ready. He took a breath, and then rushed forward. Ethan raised the device, prongs extended, ready to deliver a lethal amount of energy. He swung it down, and the gargoyle extended his wings, and Ethan was swept back in the rush of wind. He fell backward and collapsed into a pile of his own inventions. The gargoyle turned, clearly unconcerned, still holding the dark energy collection rig.
"Well, it seems my time here wasn't a complete waste," the gargoyle said. "For this, you have my thanks. Unfortunately, I'm not what you'd call a giver."
"Fortunately," Ethan said, pulling himself back up, "I am." He charged forward again, even more banged up than before. The gargoyle merely laughed and tapped a button on his wrist. A blinding flash of pure white threw Ethan from his feet. He only saw stars as he fell back and felt a shockwave ripple through what remained of his room. The rippling energy numbed his entire body to the point where he didn't even feel himself hit the floor again. Ethan wasn't sure how long it was before his vision cleared. Everything hurt now. The detection rig was gone. Everything in his room was gone. It was just rubble. Ethan stumbled to his feet. What had remained of the house had been completely pulverized. For the next few minutes, all he experienced was a daze of digging through the rubble. Digging and finding nothing. In the end, the only thing he could still recognize was the crumpled remains of the Ansible node, which he clung to as if it would somehow lead him to his family. Sirens sounded in the distance. Ethan didn't know why, but he ran. For some reason, he dreaded what they would bring. He didn't want to face them. He wanted to be alone. No, he wanted his family. That was impossible now. There was no one left in the world he wanted to face. So he ran. He ran, taking streets at random. He eventually found himself in an alley, still clutching his damaged invention. His mind slowly began to clear, just a little. That thing, the gargoyle, it had been looking at the Ansible node. It had said something about its signal, like it had followed the signal to Ethan's house. Ethan looked up to the sky. A crescent moon, a silver sphere with a bite taken out, stared back at him, the only celestial body visible within the city. His thoughts slowly congealed. A few facts settled, frozen in his mind. If the gargoyle was following the Ansible, he might just be able to use the Ansible to follow the gargoyle. It was a chance, and that's all Ethan needed right now. That and a computer. Jason Malkowski trumped through the fresh coat of snow on the way to his store. He always hated it when it snowed. It just made things more difficult. He fully expected one of his few employees to call in sick or something so they didn't have to deal with the sudden decrease in driving competence that always accompanied the fresh snow. He typed in the passcode on the keypad lock. His shabby little electronics store wasn't much, just another storefront in a strip mall, but with Jason at the helm, it had a decent enough reputation. When he worked on a job personally, the repair was always flawless. It was the rest of the team, and the need to turn a profit by selling accessories and protection plans that really held him back. Or at least that's what Jason kept telling himself. As he wiped his feet in the entrance mat, he thought something was off about the display at the front. Surely he hadn't left it askew like that. He had been the last one out, hadn't he? He scanned the rest of the shop more carefully. It appeared mostly normal, except... no. Here and there, things were missing. Just a few from select locations. It wasn't ransacked, but there was no mistaking it. He had been robbed. Jason, always hunched over like a man twice his age, hobbled towards the back where the store phone was. He had always been a bit paranoid and never carried a cell phone himself. That was an inconvenience, especially when he ran a business, but it was a fair trade in his mind to avoid having a GPS tracker on him at all times. As he turned behind the counter, he suddenly stopped short. Laying on the floor, there was a young man, about 20 years old, sprawled out asleep on the floor. Lying next to him was a laptop and the other packages and devices Jason had thought went missing. Jason gaped as he took in the scene. The kid had apparently disassembled and reassembled the various gadgets and hooked them up to a... something. A three-legged device that clearly showed signs of having just been patched up. It was hooked up to the laptop, which appeared to be running some sort of process with the device. Jason fidgeted, wondering what best to do. Should he call the police straight away, or try to wake the stranger? After all, he could clearly see that all of his stuff, though repurposed, was still here. Jason eventually decided, not wanting to trust much anyone else, to nudge the sleeping man with his foot. Immediately, Ethan Swanson shot up in a frenzy of motion. After nearly knocking everything off the counter, his eyes focused and he took in the image of Jason Malkowski, hunched over, long greasy black hair hanging from either side of his exceptionally pale face. "Why did you kick me?" Ethan asked. Jason looked confused at the bizarre reaction. "You were sleeping on my floor," he replied. "No, I wasn't." "Yes, you were. Should I get the security camera footage?" "Must have dozed off. No time for that now." Ethan picked up the laptop and the rig connected to his invention, plopping them on the counter. Without a second thought, he returned to his work, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Excuse me, don't you have anything to say for yourself?" Jason demanded, irritated at being ignored after having his shop broken into. "Yeah, I should actually schedule sleep," Ethan remarked, not taking his eyes off the computer. "Needs of biology are taxing. Also, should get a mattress." Jason, feeling like the conversation was slipping out of his control, demanded, "How did you even get in here?" "I walked," Ethan replied nonchalantly. "It was locked," Jason protested. "It was?" "Yes! I have a security system and everything!" "Pfft," Ethan scoffed. "You call that secure?" "Well, not anymore. What are you doing in my store?" "I needed a computer. And parts." "Well, you can't just take them." "You weren't open." "Does that mean you're going to pay for them, and any damage you may have caused?" "Yeah, sure, whatever." Jason waited for Ethan a moment. Ethan realized he was being stared at. "Now?" he asked. "Yes, now!" Jason shouted. "Or would you rather I have the cops throw you out?" "You're cutting into my research time," Ethan complained. Jason only became more irritated. Fine, Ethan said, pulling up his banking information. "Huh. That's funny." "Oh, I can't wait to hear this," Jason grumbled. "My accounts are all gone. All of them. How can this..." And then Ethan stopped. "That creature," he breathed in realization. "Are you sure you're okay?" Jason asked, suddenly taking a step back. This stranger had been acting weird up until this point, but if he was seeing creatures... When he broke in, he didn't just download all of my schematics, he must have uploaded some sort of virus, Ethan explained more to himself than to Jason. He quickly brought up several new pages. "Yeah, look, all of my backups gone. He's erased everything I had." "Who?" Jason asked tentatively. "This thing, like a gargoyle," Ethan explained briefly. He gestured towards his device. "I'm trying to find him with this." "What even is this?" Jason asked, humoring the man a bit longer. "It's complicated, you wouldn't understand," Ethan said dismissively. "Well, not if you don't tell me," Jason growled back. "It's an Ansible network node. It's designed to find extra-dimensional strings and use them to send signals to parallel universes," Jason finished in shock. "But that's just science fiction. Pure theory." "Well, not anymore. It looks like this gargoyle had one himself. That's why he must have been drawn to this." but I'm getting a lot of signal interference. I don't understand. Jason, suddenly more interested than terrified, looked at the application Ethan was running. Most of it was gibberish to him, but he had spent just enough time looking up strange theoretical physics stuff to recognize a little of the basics. Despite being basically impossible, Ethan's application looked legitimate. It matched the little Jason knew, at least. He was floored and intrigued.
Well, have you fully calibrated it to the native dimension's noise? Jason asked tentatively.
Of course I have. That's basic stuff.
Whatever you say, Jason said, holding up his hands defensively. It's just that, unless I'm very mistaken, those strings look like they're coming from this very dimension.
No, that can't be, Ethan dismissed. Then he looked closer.
It can't be. Well, there's so many.
He suddenly overlaid a map of the Earth, zooming in on their location.
There's some right here in the city, Ethan muttered in astonishment.
That's right where... Suddenly, Ethan dashed towards the door, grabbing the laptop and his Ansible node carelessly as he did so.
Wait, where are you going? Jason shouted after him.
You still owe me!
Sorry, no time. Write me an IOU.
But I don't even know who you are!
But the door slammed shut, and Ethan, merely a stranger to Jason Malkowski, vanished down the street. The simulator arcade wasn't open yet. Ethan surveyed the familiar buildings with a fresh, critical eye. Its modern architecture and brilliant displays and signs made it immediately obvious, impossible to miss. The advanced virtual reality games it offered also stood out in the imaginary landscape of gaming, and yet, Ethan had never put that much critical thought into the company. Simulator Inc., he now suspected, was more than just a highly advanced entertainment company. As he put his laptop to work breaking into the building, he noted that the security was several levels above the small electronics store he had recently spent the night in. It wasn't enough to stop him, of course. Ethan had broken into top-secret government databases before, more as a joke than as a serious attempt at espionage, so the front door of Simulator, while suspiciously well secured, was no big deal for him. He strolled through the empty arcade. Rows of tubes, each with colorful displays on the side identifying the games, filled the room. Inside each of the tubes would be a virtual reality suit and goggles, which allowed the players to take control of an agent character and go on different missions, depending on the tube. There were the more puzzle-oriented yellow tubes on one wall, the always paired red and blue tubes for cooperative play, and Ethan's favorite, the extremely challenging green games on the far wall. There were other colors scattered about as well. Each one offered a different scenario, with endless different ways to play through them. And on top of each of the tubes, where they met the ceiling, was a digital display wrapping around, always showing the usernames and scores of the top 10 to have beaten that challenge. Ethan noted that they had been left on, despite how vacant everything was. On the last green tube he had used, he noticed the number 1 slot now read, Ethan sucks. He felt a pang of loss and suddenly wondered just how many hours Suzanne had spent here trying to one-up him. As he thought this, he noted that under the number 2 spot of Ethan is greater than you were the users Super Sue, Suzap, and Swanson. Ethan turned away and instead scanned for a back door. He had just spotted it when the knob turned. Panic surged through him. He glanced around, quickly looking for a hiding place, and abruptly realized there were plenty all around, the virtual reality chambers themselves. He had just rushed behind one of them when the back door popped open. Ethan held his breath as 2 men in suits wheeled in a cart with what appeared to be several computers on them. They didn't notice him, caught up instead with their own conversation. "Get anything useful?" the one on the right was asking. "You'd be surprised," the left suit answered. "I hear they've made a few adjustments to the training programs based on the data here." "You mean like for recruits?" Wright replied. The 2 stopped near a black box in the middle of the room. "See the mistakes untrained gamers make and try to find the best ways to correct those?" "Sometimes, sure," Left agreed, putting a key into the black box and opening a panel to reveal another large computer. He hooked it up to the cart and started to transfer. "But you get enough of these kids to run through the scenarios and one of them comes up with some crazy idea that the agents would never have thought of." "But that's gotta be like a 1 in a million," Wright protested. "We've got millions of games running," Left shrugged. "Oh, look at this one. Case in point. New high score on green. Higher than the real mission score." "No way, that's gotta be a fluke."
but as Wright glanced at the data being copied, he looked impressed.
Still, that doesn't mean anything. Anyone can get good at these things with practice. Out in the field, they gotta fly by the seat of their pants. These simulator files mean nothing.
Well, complain all you like, but we still gotta take them into headquarters, Left replied in a sort of defeated way. He unplugged the cable and locked the black box again. Besides, if these weren't useful, why do you think Simulator would go through the trouble of setting up these arcades? They were turning to head back through the same door. Ethan readied himself. As soon as their backs were to him, he darted from chamber to chamber, staying just behind them.
Oldest reason in the book, Wright said. Well, second oldest. Money.
They went through the door, letting it slowly fall closed behind them. Ethan dashed along the wall, and just at the last moment, jammed the door open with his foot. He glanced through, and he could see the two suits just turning a corner. Silently, he pulled the door back open and squeezed through. The hallways back here were far less comfortable, clearly made with function over form in mind. The bare concrete floor was particularly distressing, as it would make Ethan's footsteps far louder than he would like. Fortunately, the footsteps of the two suited men were covering up his noise for now. Ethan hurried along, arriving at the corner they had just turned, but quickly skidded to a halt. He could hear the two men come to a stop, still carrying on their conversation, now discussing the merits, or lack thereof, of the cafeteria's food. Ethan suddenly realized the missed opportunity he had when they were still making noise. Determined not to let another slip by, he started carefully undoing his shoelaces, which was quite tricky with a laptop and Ansible node in his hands. He had just managed to step out of his right shoe when he heard the ding of an arriving elevator. He hurried out of his left sneaker as the two suits trundled their cart inside. He heard the elevator close and then spun around the corner. As expected, it was completely vacant, but he could see that the light above the elevator had indicated that it was going down. There was only one here, so he waited several seconds before hitting the call button. He carefully squished himself in an alcove, out of sight of the elevator, as he waited for it to return. When he heard the ding and the door sliding open, he waited for any confused voices, wondering why the elevator was stopping when no one was waiting. But to his relief, he heard nothing. Ethan slipped inside and glanced at the options. There were several floors, even below his current level, but at once he realized where the two men must have gone. The lowest button was marked HQ and had a slot for a keycard instead of a button. The only thing that bothered Ethan about that was how much time he would need. It wouldn't be much, but if anyone called the elevator while he was inside, he might be in trouble. So he didn't stand around thinking about it. He quickly vandalized the control panel and wired it into the laptop. It took 2 excruciating minutes, but the elevator didn't move in that time. Not until Ethan bypassed the security and commanded it to bring him down to whatever the HQ level was. The doors slid open, revealing black hallway to Ethan. It was very different from the rest of the building. It was sparse, but more advanced than anything he had seen yet. The basement was dominated by 2 features, a long hallway that seemed to extend forever, and a booth with most of the complicated controls. There was no sign of the 2 suits. Ethan glanced around, a bit confused. The basement was much smaller than the floors above, and yet the 2 men were nowhere to be seen, or heard. Ethan could only imagine that they had gone down the long hallway, but the harsh surfaces should have made their footsteps echo back to him. He carefully stepped into the room, but no one jumped out at him. He truly was all alone. Curious now, he walked into the booth. It was large enough for 2 or 3 men to fit comfortably within, and there were enough switches, buttons, and dials to keep Ethan happy for days, but he was on a mission. He quickly found a way to hook his laptop up to this as well, but it hardly clarified what everything here was. In fact, despite his brilliance, Ethan couldn't make heads or tails of what he was seeing. Whatever this booth did, it would take days for him to figure it out. But there was one thing he could decipher quite easily. There was a repeat function clearly accessible, easy to use. Anyone could use it, even with no technical knowledge whatsoever. If the 2 men had used this, and it did look like it was accessed quite recently, then maybe it would be worth trying. Ethan thought about it, grew bored of considering the ramifications, and then slammed the button. Immediately, the hallway began to glow. The black tiles were suddenly outlined in bright purple, and Ethan jumped as a bright light burst into life at the end of the corridor. All at once, the light grew. No, it approached, at sudden speed. Ethan had grabbed his stuff, ready to run out, but there was no time. He was engulfed in light and felt the platform of the booth shift under him, but his feet were glued to it, and the rest of him frozen momentarily in place. For a few seconds, it felt like the entire platform was sliding, as if on rails. And then the light faded. Ethan blinked. Everything appeared exactly the same as it had been before the corridor sprang to life. But then Ethan noticed it. Sounds. Beyond the door behind him, there was the low buzz of human activity. He quickly grabbed his stuff and snuck into a corner. Just as he did so, he noticed a flashing light on his Ansible node. It had indicated an overload in the signal receiver. Curious, Ethan took a chance and glanced back at the readout on his laptop. The data there was a jumbled mess, and Ethan was immediately interested, quickly parsing the variables. And then his jaw dropped. That Jason guy had reminded him to pay attention to the background signals. The background signals, the signature noise that existed on each dimension. Looking at them now, they had changed. It could only mean one thing. He was in another dimension. Ethan suddenly became excited. The gargoyle had arrived from another dimension, summoned by Ethan's Ansible signal, but now, with this thing, Ethan had found a way to move between dimensions himself. But this corridor hadn't allowed for many destinations. It seemed to mostly go back and forth from the simulator arcade to wherever he was now. Time to find out more about this place. Ethan cracked the door open and heard the murmur of voices a little more clearly, but no one was in the hallway he had just revealed. Ethan glanced at the Ansible node and his laptop again. He was getting many good signals here. If he was right, they were for more corridors like this one. He picked one to check out and brazenly marched into the hallway, following the signal. Soon, he found another strange corridor room, but this one was even more strange and fantastical than the last. There was another black corridor, a booth, but also several workstations and interesting new tools scattered around every which way. And in the center, there was something truly intriguing. A green exoskeleton with a white head. Like a futuristic suit of armor, wires and tubes were running from this to several workstations. Clearly it was a work in progress. Ethan was fascinated, forgetting a moment about the mysterious interdimensional corridors, but soon his attention was stolen away yet again. Voices were heading his way. This time, a hiding space was easy to find. He crouched below the furthest workstation as the door opened. A strange man in yellow entered with the two men Ethan had seen before. "Not ready for trial data," the man in yellow was saying. "Still much work to be done. Barely functional as it is." "Look, I'm just passing on the message," Wright replied. "Lots of demands for this project," Yellow sighed. "Such an intensive creation, just for green. Hopefully prototype can be recreated later, but so resource intensive." "Well, if anyone can get it to work, it's you," Left said reassuringly. Yellow and Wright mumbled their agreement, and then the little group dispersed. Yellow was the only one to remain in the room. Ethan held back a sigh. He was now trapped with this yellow guy in the room, and this was clearly where he worked. That made things tricky. But he was so close. Simulator actually traveled dimensions. Their VR was not quite so virtual after all. This was yellow, Ethan realized, and he had mentioned a green. An Agent Green that the suit was for. The same green that no doubt lived the actual scenarios his beloved green arcade games were based on. All of those bizarre worlds in the games could potentially be real, all various dimensions, and that gargoyle was in one of them. The gargoyle. Ethan was going to find him. For his mother, for his father, for his sister, he wouldn't be stopped by anyone, not even these real agents. Ethan began by hooking his laptop up to the computers again. He quickly confirmed that the corridor in here was an interdimensional passageway. Even better, its location could be programmed. But just as he was comparing his Ansible data to possible dimensions, the network kicked him out. Ethan blinked. That had never happened before. Ever. Not even when he had hacked into the government systems. Something found him and kicked him out. Adrenaline shot through him as he began typing furiously. An alarm must have already been triggered if he was detected. There was nothing he could do to stop that in time. Maybe he could redirect it. No, he was shut down again. Something was fighting him in the system. Everything he was trying was being detected. Soon he would be traced. There was only one idea Ethan had. He began hacking one last time, but this time he was sloppy. Or at least, so it appeared. As expected, he was detected, and soon an alarming ping went off next to Yellow. Yellow tapped a communicator and said, "Yes? Agent Yellow, I have detected an intruder in our computer network," a smooth female voice told him. "I have traced the intrusion to Quick Transit Corridor 3. As the closest agent, I am assigning you to apprehend the intruder. Weapons authorized." Yellow looked startled. "Do I get any time tokens?" "None are available at this time. Please use caution." Yellow nodded nervously, then punched a number on a small case, releasing a matching yellow blaster. He nervously sidled out of the room. As soon as the door shut, Ethan sprang up. He raced over to the corridor controls. He tried setting a destination to one of the signals detected from the gargoyle. Immediately, a siren went off in the room. "Intruder alert in experimental corridor 1, the female voice announced. From the sound of it, it was echoing throughout the entire complex. Ethan furrowed his brow. "Tattletale," he grumbled at the speaker in the ceiling, but there was no time to lose. He tried entering a destination again, but his access was denied. He heard someone approaching outside. He grabbed the chair Yellow had been sitting on and jammed it under the door handle. He grabbed all of the heavy things he could find and barricaded it. Someone slammed into the door, but it didn't budge. He could hear Yellow shouting in pain. Ethan ran back to the control and tried hacking again, but there was no way to get past without authorization. And there was no way he had time to fake it. He needed a real security credential. In desperation, Ethan glanced back around the room for anything, though he didn't expect to see anything that could help him. But then, his eyes fell on the exoskeleton. It had been designed for Green, that much was obvious. Green, whose games were always the hardest, who was apparently getting a special prototype. Surely, if anyone had credentials... Yellow slammed his shoulder against the door again, quite painfully. "Agent Yellow," Chroma Computer said in his comm, "might I suggest the use of your blaster?"
"But my work," Yellow protested. "Sensitive equipment. What damage would be done?"
"Agent Yellow, every minute you delay gives the intruder more time to sabotage this same work." Yellow looked pained but raised his blaster. Squeezing the trigger, he blew apart the door. Sparking bits of equipment shattered inwards, and Yellow let out a moan. He had just blown apart some of his tools and equipment used to barricade the door. As Yellow delayed to mourn, Agents Red and Blue dashed past him, diving into the room. They turned, blasters raised while scanning for the intruder. Instead, they saw a green prototype exoskeleton holding a laptop and a strange three-legged device standing in front of an active corridor.
"Stop right there," Blue managed to blurt.
"Or, hear me out," Ethan said from within the exoskeleton. "I stop just over there." And he stepped into the light of the corridor and vanished. Blue and Red exchanged glances.
"What was that?"
Blue asked. "A new toy for Green," Red grumbled.
"So not the point?"
Ethan Swanson believes he is on the trail of the mysterious gargoyle who killed his family, but is he really? Has he finally gotten in over his head, finding a puzzle too sophisticated for even his brilliant mind? And what dangers will he find on the other end of the corridor? Find out next time on the Mirage Barrage.